The Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation will come to order. Good morning, and welcome to today's hearing entitled Empowering Consumers and Promoting Innovation Through the Smart Grid. I want to thank all of you for coming, and Mr. Sarbanes from Maryland is stuck in traffic due to our weather, and I thank you for braving the weather this morning. But in front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witness. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today's hearing will evaluate the progress that has been made on the development and implementation of a nationwide smart grid. The blackout that darkened the Northeast in the summer of 2003 opened our eyes to the vulnerability and age of our electrical system. One of the planned improvements is to modernize our electrical grid to create a system that can communicate information and relay electricity in two directions, both to and from the consumer. The smart grid has the potential to improve the reliability of electric power delivery and promote economic growth through the development of new technologies. Given the scale and complexity of our electric grid, this transition will require systems that can seamlessly communicate. In 2007, the Energy and Independent Security Act, directed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to coordinate the development of a common framework including protocols and model standards for the implementation of smart grid technologies. Nist plays a key role bringing together manufacturers, consumers, energy providers, and regulators to develop interoperable standards to ensure that the smart grid's many pieces are able to work together. As a non-regulatory agency, Nist has a long history of collaborating with industry to develop voluntary standards. However, the Energy and Independent Security Act empowers the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to initiate a rulemaking process to adopt standards where it believes a sufficient consensus has been achieved. I am concerned with the prospect of mandating standards and the effect such mandates could potentially have on innovation. There may be parts of the smart grid where formal regulation is unnecessary and a consensus standard is sufficient to ensure interoperability. I generally believe that we should avoid imposing regulations on industry and innovators when a collaborative product is possible through NIST's non-regulatory process. The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology has held a series of hearings assessing the transformation of our electric delivery system to a smart grid. Today's hearing will further detail the progress that has been made by examining the status of efforts to develop the open standards that are necessary to support cost-effective deployment of smart grid technologies. We should not underestimate the value of standards. Open, consensus-based standards help facilitate the development of new, innovative technologies by promoting plug-and-play operability for smart grid devices in both the national and international markets. I'm especially interested in how a smarter grid could enable small companies to develop new products based on a transparent standards platform that is available to all innovators. With the many renewable energy companies in my home state of Arizona, I'm also interested in how the updated grid could allow small generators and intermittent renewable energy sources to play a larger role in our electrical system. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their participation today. I'd also like to welcome and thank the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for his role in the hearing today, and I now recognize him for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your calling this hearing. This is a critical hearing, and we're looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today with respect to the progress that's being made in this standard setting. Putting in place a smart grid for the country is a huge priority, and of course, if you look at the Energy Independence and Security Act, that was one of its premier objectives back in 2007. There was a real boost to your efforts, of course, with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in terms of dollars being put behind this effort. The effort is well underway. I understand I've only come to this hearing this committee recently, but I understand there was a hearing about a year ago which examined the progress that was being made, and I take it that there's really 3 phases that this effort represents. The first phase was setting up this framework and roadmap for the smart grid interoperability. The second phase is to get this panel working, and I know we'll hear about that today. And then the third phase is really to go out and test this and certify it, make sure that that it's really working. There's a lot of tentacles involved in this. You're pulling in a lot of different input from many, many different sources, of course. The private sector, prior public standards efforts that have been put in place, and so forth. So we are looking forward to this update, and we want to know what we can do to help facilitate the progress that you're making, both in terms of tools that you have and the resources that are available to you. We all want a grid that is more reliable and resilient, that's more efficient and cost effective, and you can read into that last phrase, not wasteful, and one that's secure. That's obviously a key concern these days as well. And we can look at this through various lenses. I mean, we just went through this tremendous weather event here on the East Coast with the hurricane. In Maryland, we had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that were without power for days on end. The systems we have for reporting outages and attending to them are in some ways antiquated when you compare it against the smart grid vision that we have. And we get that kind of thing in place, you're going to be able to identify where these outages have occurred, respond to them more quickly, figure out how to bypass transformers and other parts of the grid that may be down so that you can keep power in place for as many of the customers, whether they be businesses or individuals, as possible. So that's certainly one lens to look at this smart grid enterprise through. Another I bring, which is, I guess, somewhat parochial, but in my district pretty much surrounds the NSA organization in Baltimore, which is located at Fort Meade. And there have been concerns, I know, of the last few years by leaders at NSA about whether just the power source is going to be there to sustain their operations over time. So that goes to the question of just whether you have a reliable source of power for these critical assets that exist out there. And so we're obviously very interested in the reliability, in the efficiency of these operations, and the security, which I think is something that you'll get to in our discussion. So we know that there's a lot left to do. I do want to commend Nist from my understanding of the progress you've already made. There's a lot of different balls in the air here, and of course everyone wants to get this in place as quickly as we can. So appreciate the testimony that you'll present here today. We're looking forward to it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling the hearing, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I would like to introduce our witnesses, and then we will proceed to hear from each of them in order. Our first witness is Dr. George Arnold, the National Coordinator for Smart Grid Interoperability at Nist. Next, we'll hear from the Honorable Donna Nelson, Chairman of the Texas Public Utility Commission. Our third witness is Mr. John Caskey, Assistant Vice President of Industry Operations at the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. Our final witness is Mr. Rik Drummond, CEO and Chief Scientist at the Drummond Group. Thanks again to our witnesses for being here this morning. As our witnesses know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each. After all witnesses have spoken, members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Chair now recognizes our first witness, Dr. Arnold.
Chairman Quayle, Ranking Member Sarbanes, and members of the subcommittee, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to discuss NIST's progress in accelerating the development of standards for the smart grid, which, as you noted, is central to the nation's efforts to promote innovations that increase the reliability, efficiency, and security of the electric delivery system and provide benefits to consumers. The basic structure of today's grid has changed little over its 100-year history. The U.S. grid is operated by over 3,200 utilities using equipment and systems from hundreds of suppliers, with little past innovation on standardization, resulting in many proprietary systems that do not interoperate. The successful transformation of this aging infrastructure will have important economic and consumer benefits. As you've noted, under the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, Congress assigned Nist the primary responsibility to coordinate the development of standards for the smart grid. Nist is providing strong national and international leadership in carrying out this assignment. In April 2009, Nist announced a three-phase plan to carry out its responsibilities. The initial phase resulted in the January 2010 publication of the Nist Framework and Roadmap for Smart Grid Interoperability Standards, Release 1. This document described a reference model for the smart grid, identified 75 initial standards, and specified 16 high-priority action plans to fill gaps. Another significant milestone was the September 2010 publication of the Nist Guidelines for Smart Grid Cybersecurity, Release 1, which provides foundational guidance for the cybersecurity of the grid. The second phase of the Nist effort established the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, or SGIP. The panel's membership has grown to over 680 private and public sector organizations with almost 1,800 individuals participating in its committees and working groups. The SGIP also provides a forum for international collaboration, benefiting U.S. exporters of smart grid products. The SGIP has achieved many significant accomplishments since its formation, which are described in my written testimony. The SGIP is making progress in developing a smart grid testing and certification framework, the third phase of the Nist effort, which is chaired by my colleague, Mr. Drummond. To date, 5 private sector organizations have announced testing and certification programs following the SGIP's guidelines. Nist is in the process of updating the smart grid framework, and we anticipate publication of Release 2.0 by the end of 2011. Nist's smart grid work has been enabled by funding from both the Recovery Act and Nist's annual appropriations. A significant portion of Nist's smart grid budget has been used to fund the administration and operation of the SGIP. In the longer term, our vision is that the SGIP will mature into an independent organization funded primarily by the private sector to evolve the standards framework after Nist's coordination role is complete. However, it will take several years for the SGIP to develop a business model and private sector funding sources that are self-sustaining. To guide the longer-term planning for Nist's work, Nist has established a Smart Grid Federal Advisory Committee whose first report is expected in November of 2011. Throughout this process, Nist has worked closely with the Department of Energy and federal and state regulators. ESA directs FERC to institute a rulemaking to adopt standards as necessary after Nist's work has led to sufficient consensus. However, voluntary use of consensus standards rather than regulation may be sufficient in most cases to ensure the interoperability of the smart grid. In other national infrastructures, such as the telecommunications system and the Internet, few, if any, interoperability standards have been mandated through regulation. In 2011, the FERC decision found that there was insufficient consensus to institute a rulemaking proceeding and expressed support for the Nist process and referred stakeholders to the Nist process for guidance on smart grid standards. Our standards efforts play an important role in promoting innovation that will benefit consumers. The standards help avoid stranded utility investments by facilitating interoperability and upgradability. The standards promote vendor competition and economies of scale that result in lower costs for consumers. The standards help enable the development of innovative third-party applications and smart appliances to help consumers save energy and reduce peak usage and overall usage. Finally, through this work, Nist is leading the development of rigorous open standards and guidelines for cybersecurity and data privacy through public-private cooperation. Nist is proud to have been given an important role in this initiative, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Arnold. The Chair now recognizes Chairman Donna Nelson to present her testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Quayle. Good morning, and good morning to Ranking Member Sarbanes and members of the subcommittee. I'm Donna Nelson, Chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Texas. Thank you for the opportunity to appear here before you today to discuss the progress that we've made in Texas in implementing a smart grid. I'd like to highlight several things that I think have made our program in Texas successful. To tell the story of the smart grid in Texas is to tell the story of the success of the competitive electric market in Texas. The ERCOT region of Texas and ERCOT stands for Electric Reliability Council of Texas, is located entirely within the state of Texas, and that makes Texas different than every other state in the continental U.S., and it represents 85% of the electric load in the state. The ERCOT region has a successful competitive market. We have competitive generation, we have competitive retail providers, which we call REPs, but the TDUs, transmission and distribution utilities, the ones that own the wires and poles, are still regulated by the Commission. And the competitive market has served us well in Texas. It's spurred a lot of investment, and it's ultimately spurred the installment of smart meters. In the mid-2000s, though, natural gas prices were rising, and Texas is a natural gas on the margin state, and our state was growing. And so policy leaders in Texas have the view that they really want everything to be able to provide electricity. We need all resources. And one of those resources is, of course, the demand response that you can get from the smart grid technology. Against this backdrop, the state legislature wanted Texas to have that tool, so they passed legislation encouraging the implementation of advanced meters and directing us, the PUC, to establish a cost recovery mechanism for utilities. We did that. We adopted a rule, and it covered customer and rep access to data, minimum standards for advanced meter system deployment, cost recovery, and utility deployment plans. The four major utilities in ERCOT, that would be CenterPoint, Encore, AEP, and Texas New Mexico Power, have received approval from the Commission for deployment of smart meters in their service territories. They've, to date, deployed 4 million smart meters and are scheduled to deploy a total of 7 million by the end of 2013. I'd like to touch on a few key components that we believe have allowed for fast deployment. First, the state legislature encouraged deployment but did not mandate it. Second, the legislature explicitly provides that customers own their own smart meter data and are in control of authorizing access to an entity other than their retail provider. Third, the Texas PUC has overseen an implementation initiative in order to make the smart grid a reality. The initiative is comprised of a stakeholder collaborative with representatives from utilities, vendors, reps, and consumers. And finally, reps strongly supported the rollout of the smart grid technology because in a highly competitive retail market, they wanted to have a competitive advantage over other companies. State commissions maintain jurisdiction over the distribution grid and have the ultimate responsibility for adoption and enforcement of rules relating to utilities and retail markets. It's important that the processes at Nist and at the FERC continue to recognize the role of state commissions. We believe that the creation of open national standards can create a level playing field across industry, sectors, and the markets. In the long term, standards should ensure interoperability of devices across utility service territories and across the country. I want to stress that a balance must be struck between existing standards that enable deployment and allow for benefits to reach consumers today while working to refine and create future standards to address the smart grid of tomorrow. Let me close by stating that regardless of whether a state has restructured its electric industry, as Texas has done, there are many benefits to be realized from the smart grid. Many customers want more information about their electricity bills. We're currently, two of our largest utilities are doing pilots, and they're finding that customers are responding very well to the smart grids and are reducing their electric usage. And standards are constantly evolving because technology does not wait. Policy at the federal and state level should continue to recognize the need for customer choice and control and provide guidelines for the smart grid, not mandates. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today and share the Texas experience.
Thank you, Chairman Nelson. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Caskey for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Quayle and members of the subcommittee. My name is John Caskey, and I am the Assistant Vice President of Operations and the Director of the Power Equipment Division at the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, NEMA. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to testify today. My testimony today is informed by more than 30 years of experience in the energy field. As a Director of the Power Equipment Division at NEMA, I work directly with the manufacturers that produce products that make up the electric grid and the evolving smart grid. In addition, I am the Vice Chair of the Governing Board of the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, SGIP, and the Chair of the SGIP Vision, Mission, Roadmap Task Team. On the SGIP Governing Board, I represent the Standards Development Organizations and the Specifying Organizations. Nema is a trade association for the electrical and medical imaging manufacturing industry. Founded in 1926 and headquartered in Roslyn, Virginia, our member companies manufacture products used in the generation, transmission, distribution, control, and end use of electricity that exceeds $120 billion in worldwide sales. One of Nema's primary mission, of particular relevance to today's hearing, is that we are a Standards Development Organization, or SDO, accredited by the American National Standards Institute. NEMA member companies are technology leaders and have been researching, developing, and deploying smart grid technologies for many years. In most cases, the technologies needed to support smart grid are already available and have been deployed on a limited basis across the country. However, what has been missing is a complete set of standards and associated testing and certification requirements that ensure interoperability of the different components of the grid. This is our greatest challenge. The Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, in which this committee played a critical role, blazes new trails in the development of smart grid. Title 13 of ESA charged the National Institute of Standards and Technology with the lead role in coordinating the development of a framework and model standards to ensure interoperability in the smart grid. NEMA is one of the non-government agencies named in ESA to work with Nist on the implementation of the interoperability framework of standards for smart grid. One example of NEMA's role as an SDO in the development of the NEMA Smart Meter Upgradability Standard. This standard was developed and approved through an ANSI-accredited process within 90 days of Nist requests for NEMA's help. This standard was accomplished through the cooperation and work of 5 major meter manufacturers, several utilities, the Department of Energy, and Nist. This formation and funding of the SGIP public-private partnership have been crucial for bringing all the smart grid stakeholders together to develop needed standards. NEMA believes that the federal government should continue to serve as a partner with industry in the effort to establish smart grid standards. These standards are ultimately what will empower the consumer and drive cybersecurity, improved reliability, and cost minimization. In addition, promoting these U.S. smart grid standards internationally is one way to strengthen the export market for U.S. manufactured products. NEMA has taken the lead with the assistance from the Department of Commerce to promote the U.S. Smart Grid Roadmap in Mexico and Canada. In addition, through a U.S. Trade and Development Agency program, NEMA is promoting the U.S. Smart Grid Roadmap in China. As these countries and others adopt our smart grid architecture and standards, it opens the market for American manufacturers and creates the opportunity for more American jobs. 3 additional thoughts I'd like to leave with you today. Number 1, the next major step for the SGIP is to create a roadmap that will lead the organization forward for the next 3 years. The Nist framework has led us this far by identifying the most immediate standards work that needed to be completed over the first 2 years of the SGIP. Now the SGIP leadership needs to focus on providing direction for the next phase of smart grid development. Item 2 is there continues to be confusion about the definition of consensus and the possibility for mandatory smart grid standards. Many people, including myself, define consensus as a product or policy that everyone can live with. Others feel that consensus requires a supermajority such as 75%. Still others feel that passing a simple majority of 51% signifies consensus. NEMA believes that the SGIP should work with FERC and Nist to resolve this issue before any standards are made mandatory by any federal agency. The third point is that smart grid standards are radically more complex than most existing standards. Smart grid standards require an evolution from simple physical standards, such as defining the physical attributes of an everyday 120-volt electric appliance plug, to very complicated communication and protocol standards that may offer hundreds of variations in the application of those standards. This issue radically changes the meaning of compliance and our understanding of the concepts of interoperability and plug-and-play. This may be the first time that commissions and consumers will be exposed to the realization that you can have 2 products that meet the same standard that do not talk to one another and do not provide the same functionality. I am happy to address these issues in more detail and answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me here to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Caskey. The Chair now recognizes our final witness, Mr. Drummond, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Quayle, Congressman Sarbanes, and other committee members. I'm Rik Drummond, CEO of Drummond Group, Inc., a Gridwise Architecture Council member, a board member of SGIP, and the chair of SGIP Testing and Certification Committee. Drummond Group has been heavily involved in the smart grid since 2004, when I became the initial chair of the DOE-sponsored Smart Grid Architecture Council in 2005-2006. Smart Grid Architectural Council was the initial group that started socializing the need for general interoperability among software and hardware to solve the known and projected problems in the United States power grid. The interoperability requirement is now in ESA 2007 legislation and is the basis for the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel's objectives. The challenges of SGIP Testing and Certification Committee faces in working together to develop an interoperability framework for testing and certification are best elucidated by discussing the key components of the SGIP Interoperability Testing Framework, which we call the Interoperability Process Reference Manual, or IPRM. The first version of this was released in January 11, about 9 months after the start of SGIP. And I'll go through the 4 sections very briefly here. The first section is how do we enhance testing lab processes for quality and repeatability. We chose to base these on the ISO international standards of 17025, which talk about quality for test labs. Our challenge here is that I expect that this will probably increase testing costs by about 25%, and we're working that within the committee. Section number 2, requirements for certifying test lab results by trusted third parties. This section is again based on an ISO 65 guide. The challenge is that many product vendors and associations question the need for additional cost associated with paying for third parties to certify test lab results. These first 2 sections, by the way, parallel the efforts going on in Health and Human Services testing and certification endeavor for implementing EHR meaningful use across Medicaid and Medicare. Number 3, guidance for testing for cybersecurity mechanisms within a software product. Security testing of cybersecurity mechanisms and interoperability testing are normally at odds philosophically. Security attempts to restrict available functionality depending upon the authorization, while interoperability attempts to remove the restrictions so that information flows between entities. Testing for both of these at the same time, where we can, will save cost and money. The last section, guidance on how to achieve interoperability in testing. Currently, many test labs do not verify interoperability. They only verify conformance of a product to a standard and assume that conformance includes interoperability. Frequently, conformance does not ensure interoperability. Interoperability must be verified during testing, and this has been a challenging point to get across. As you can see, our challenges are many, but they're being solved through negotiation and collaboration. A question you asked me, Chairman Quayle, in the invitation letter was, what can the federal government do to help facilitate interoperability and cybersecurity in the smart grid? And after much thought, I'm going to suggest one thing here. The federal government could ensure that wide availability of conformant interoperable products are in the marketplace by requiring all products purchased by the federal government have been verified through testing and certification procedures, much like that in the Interoperability Process Reference Manual. Since the federal government is about 25% of GDP, this would have a sizable impact in the smart grid and other industries. In summary, the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel and Testing and Certification Committee is making significant progress in achieving the wide availability of high-quality, conformant, and interoperable products in the smart grid marketplace, as specified in ESA 2007. The frameworks, the testing framework, the IPRM, full implementation within the industry will take years to accomplish, and that's as it should. As the power grid industry segment moves to better understanding of interoperability solutions, the interoperability testing framework, and its purpose and benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Drummond, and I'd like to thank all their witnesses for their testimony. I just want to remind members that the committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes, and the chair will at this point open the round of questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Caskey, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 required that FERC initiate a formal rulemaking process to adopt interoperability standards when it is satisfied that consensus was actually met. Do you believe that a formal rulemaking process is necessary, or do you think that a consensus could be achieved without that formal rulemaking process?
I think that they're two different things. I think reaching a consensus on the standards that need to be applied for smart grid is one thing, and we're working towards that, and I think we are meeting those requirements within the SGIP and the governing board of the SGIP. In terms of a rulemaking process, I personally do not think that it's necessary at this time and really doesn't benefit the development and the innovation going on in smart grid at this point. At some point in the future, it may be more appropriate.
So do you think that within the rulemaking process that those standards that could have been achieved that could be potentially harmful for innovation going forward? Is that?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Well, you said that possibly the rulemaking process could have a detrimental effect on innovation going forward. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I don't think we're to the point yet of locking in any particular standards and making those standards mandatory. We're still growing those standards and modifying those standards, and at some point in the future, having mandatory standards or rulemaking on those standards makes sense, but not right now from my perspective.
Okay, thank you. Chairman Nelson, in your testimony you described that all the progress that Texas has made, and you mentioned that you had put forward about 4 million smart meters onto the marketplace. Texas is obviously a unique state in that it produces most of its own energy. Do you think that actually putting out these types of smart meters prior to the standards actually being set is putting the cart before the horse, or do you think it's a push to just kind of spur that process going forward?
Well, I do recognize that it's a delicate balance. I think that if a state were to implement a smart grid program like Texas did, and it were to do it in a way where you had open architecture and you made sure that however you implemented it would be in conformance with things moving forward, I think that you could do it. But it is difficult. It's difficult to do it without standards.
Okay. Dr. Arnold, in January of 2011, the GAO noted that that FERC doesn't have the authority to enforce standards and recognized that the regulatory divide exists between federal, state, and local entities on various aspects of smart grid interoperability and cybersecurity. The GAO further stated that such standards will remain voluntary unless regulators use other authorities to enforce compliance. What really distinguishes the process of developing voluntary consensus standards from developing standards likely to be mandated and enforceable?
Well, I think it's instructive to look at some other examples in other infrastructure, such as the telecommunications network. And there, as I noted, that the vast majority of standards are voluntary consensus standards, which are used by industry because there's a benefit to industry in doing that. One example where it made sense to mandate a functionality or a standard was number portability, where to promote competition in the local exchange market, the FCC mandated the ability for consumers to take their telephone numbers when they switched carriers. There was no incentive for the service providers to implement that capability because it was costly, and why would they want to promote competition? So there was a case where, in order to have that policy objective implemented, it made sense to mandate it. I think at this point, in my opinion, it's too early to tell whether there are such analogs in the smart grid. But if there are, then it may make sense in selective cases like that.
Okay, thank you very much. And Chair now recognizes Mr. Sarbanes for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony. I'm trying to get my head around sort of the notion that there's parts of the grid that are already smart. I mean, we talk about a smart grid, but Chairman Nelson, you sort of alluded to in your testimony the fact that there are parts of our national grid that you would view as being smart. And I don't know if anybody's in a position to quantify that somehow, but maybe you could try and tell me, I mean, what percentage, knowing what you know and knowing what kind of the aspirational standards are that you're working on, what percentage of the grid now is smart, or is that not a helpful way to at least get a baseline perspective on this? Anybody?
I guess I would say it is very hard to quantify. In Texas, the way we started is we started out with a roll out of the advanced meters to the customers, because we felt like to have customer, if you're going to be spending money, you want to have customer acceptance and you want them to see the benefits. So we have that, and we're slowly making the rest of the grid smart, you know, so that you can have things like self-healing distribution lines and transmission lines. So I would say at this point it's hard to quantify, just because I don't know if you give the meters more of a percentage than the lines, and it would just be difficult to quantify it.
Chairman Nelson, do you have, or Chairman Dr. Arnold, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, there are so many different technologies that apply in an end-to-end system that I think the fact that we have 50 states that each can, in their unique environments, apply these technologies allows us to benefit from those experiences and roll them out nationally based on best practices. Certainly, the automation that is now being deployed in the transmission network with phaser measurement units, which will provide wide area visibility, will have tremendous benefits in reliability of the bulk power system, and that's well underway with Recovery Act funding. The application of smart meters, in addition to the benefit in terms of energy savings that consumers can have through access to information, also provides that visibility to the utilities for restoration after power outages. So I think it would be a mistake to try to deploy everything at once, because these are new technologies that need to be proven in, and the approach that we're taking of having nationally the ability to benefit from the different state deployments as well as the deployments in the bulk power system is a very good way forward.
One of the themes that we've heard already in your testimony and in the questions that Chairman Quayle just asked is this notion of kind of mandatory versus voluntary approach over time. And it sounds, Mr. Drummond, like you believe that the biggest nut to crack, the toughest problem, is the interoperability issue. And we see that across the board. I mean, the 9/11 Commission just came back, the chairman, to talk about the remaining challenges of interoperability there, even though that was a #1 priority years ago in the wake of that disaster, to try to cure those problems. And, maybe humans are innately inoperable, non-interoperable, if that's a word. But that would seem like an area where mandating some things would be called for, and I'd just like to get your reaction to that.
Interoperability has a lot of meanings. The way we've focused on it in SGIP testing and certification is that we see it as it needs to be market-driven. Businesses who buy products need to understand the cost-benefit trade-offs from buying interoperably verified, certified products versus buying those which have not been that way. An example, I've been doing this for a long time, and I remember back 8 or 9 years ago on a different standard, we were doing interoperability testing, and people who would use those which had been certified would be able to install it within 2 or 3 days and make it work. Those who didn't might spend 6 months trying to get the product to work interoperably with someone else. So the key here is we need to put products in the marketplace that people can be assured are interoperable easily. That's why I keep saying the word certified by certified third parties. So the marketplace can see the cost benefit and start putting those in place. We can make anything computer-wise interoperable, pairwise. It's when you have hundreds of things happening over and over again, you do not want to keep repeating the same development cycle on integration. You want to make it much easier because it's already been done before, because it's already been tested and certified. I really think the market can drive this well. And the suggestion I had before was not so much going into regulations or anything else. It was thinking about if the federal government has so much buying clout out there, and if you all saw it was beneficial to start buying certified interoperable products using testing as we're recommending, that would push multiple industries, just not this one, into a more interoperable, more cost-efficient model than we have right now as we put things in place. The last point is, if I buy interoperable products, I reduce my perceived risk as a manager or an executive in a corporation if I know they're really not interoperable. And I will move faster to implement new things in the network if that risk is reduced. When I still do not know my risk because I don't have certified products out there, I take much longer to move to the next phase of the network, the more intelligent network, because the risk is too high for me to move very quickly without doing a lot of due diligence. Did I answer your question?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Mrs. Biggert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. And I commend the witnesses for all the collaborative work that you are doing on this issue. My question is related to the type of technology that the standard development process will eventually allow. And do you see room for variable types of smart grid technologies? And the reason for this is that some of my constituents have raised privacy or health concerns with the smart grid devices, especially the wireless technologies. And this is from a community that has been working on this since 2005, and to develop the smart grid and the smart meters. And so this has come up from some of the constituents. And what happened here is actually that they did a survey and everyone agreed to have mandatory, have it as mandatory technology. So do you see that there's a mix of technologies being deployed that can address their concerns and still meet the goals of an interoperable smart grid? But mainly it's the two issues. One is the health concerns and also privacy when they have the meters in their homes. Dr. Arnold, I'd like to know if all of you can address this.
Well, there are two aspects to that. In terms of privacy, this is a very important issue in the smart grid, and we are paying very strong attention to it. In fact, in our 700-page cybersecurity guidelines, we have a whole volume that is devoted to privacy issues, and that volume includes an analysis of data privacy issues in the smart grid, a summary of applicable laws and regulations at the federal and state level, and provides guidance on how to apply business practices and technology to ensure data privacy. There are also some specific business practice standards that, consistent with those guidelines, that are now under development by the North American Energy Standards Board. So this is an area that we are actively addressing. On the health aspects of wireless communications, I'd say that's a little bit outside of our jurisdiction because the FCC sets requirements on emission levels for wireless devices. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, devices that are being used in smart grid applications, they have to comply with the FCC requirements. So I think
well, they
refer to that process.
This community is having 15 gigawatts of energy that will be, and it's a lot stronger than what they're doing right now as far as they put this into effect. They're worried about that. So maybe Chairman Nelson, could you address that since you are also putting these in?
Well, let me just start out by talking about the privacy aspect. And in Texas, our legislature made that determination by saying customers own their own data. And so Texas now, the commission is in the process of fleshing out that, because one of the things that we found most critical as you go forward in installing smart meters is that customers understand what's happening. And so we want to make sure that the process where third parties come in and contact them is a fair process. In terms of the safety issue, I think there's a lot of evidence that that the systems are safe. In terms of whether you can use whether one system should be mandated, that's not the way that Texas went. We went with an option of letting the companies choose the technology, the transmission and distribution utilities.
Okay. Mr. Caskey, do you have anything?
Yes, a couple different points. One is dealing with technology. I think the connection with the consumer is often at the meter, so often consumers are first concerned about that. I've read various studies by the Electric Power Research Institute and other organizations, and at least so far they have not found any evidence between any health concerns and the radio type receivers and transmitters used in the smart grid and the smart meter deployment. Certainly if there are issues associated with that or they're concerned, perceived issues associated with that, you can potentially take that out, but then you lose some of the features and the benefits of those meters, so they may not be very cost effective once you take away that two-way communication aspect of those smart meters. Also in terms of technologies, I mean there's a wide variety of technologies, including at the generation of power, Dr. Arnold had referenced the transmission grid itself, at the distribution grid. I mean, there are lots of different technologies that make up the smart grid. You know, there are literally hundreds of various technologies that will be applied to get the whole smart grid to work effectively together.
Thank you. Mr. Drummond?
I'm of the opinion generally that we in the architecture realm, which is what we're talking about now, the smart grid is an architecture, our framework, need to put in place the philosophical principles behind it and what should work together, what shouldn't. That would be for privacy and technology. And let the lower levels, those who are dealing with the implementation and those sort of things, start making decisions in more detail. And if you do it in that manner, that means that you can change over time easily as new standards happen. You can use slightly different standards for exactly the same reason in different areas because they would work best in those areas. So I think in answer to your initial question, there's a lot of variety out there you can go do. There's always this trade-off about how much you mandate, specific standard to go do this, which will actually reduce risk a whole lot, on my risk thing earlier, but it also squashes innovation. So you have this, we're kind of sitting on the head of a pin here trying to weigh both of those sort of things at once. And I think we're doing that well in SGIP right now, by the way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Biggert. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Arnold, I want to talk a little bit about distributed generation and what that means to a nationwide interoperable grid. Distributed generation can reduce pollution, it can increase energy efficiency, promote the use of renewable generation, empower homeowners and business owners. It's been suggested that when we've had blackouts or brownouts in some of the most urban metro areas of the country, that if there would have been a more elaborate distributed generation system, that we could have alleviated some of that load. One of the principal barriers to the deployment of distributed generation is the process of connecting to the utility grid, the interconnection or the interoperability, if you will. We need common standards for interconnecting DG devices into the grid system. This year I've introduced a bill promoting net metering and established interconnection standards for net metering. Like Chairman Nelson, I once chaired the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, which is the equivalent of the public utility commissions around the country, and it was an honor to serve there. Everything that I learned there was that you needed to have those interconnection standards in order to push distributed generation and make it a reality so that one thing could talk to another, i.e. making it smart, I guess. Can you discuss efforts to develop common standards that support distributed generation that help empower consumers?
Certainly. Well, first I can tell you that supporting distributed generation in the smart grid is one of the key requirements from the beginning in our effort, and we have a number of standards in our framework that provide the technical capability for this, including the metering standards, which have to support two-way measurement, the electrical and information connection standards. There's a standard known as IEEE 1547, that has been enhanced to support this. And I'd also note that we've been successful in getting the IEC to adopt that as an international standard, so that we're kind of leading the global approach on this. There's a lot more that needs to be done, though, because as the growth of these resources increases, the ability for utilities to know how much distributed generation is feeding into the grid and be able to forecast that becomes critical to maintain the reliability of the grid. And so to address the information management standards to support this, the SGIP is in the process of forming a new working group specifically looking at this whole suite of standards for distributed generation and storage. And I believe the official approval of this working group is going to take place this afternoon at the governing board meeting. So this has been a major area of focus and will continue to be.
That's encouraging, Dr. Arnold, that those conversations are taking place. Again, working with an industry group, with IEEE, associated with seeing how you can establish some of these interconnection standards so that way there's more certainty out there. Many states have adopted net metering standards. It's one that I hope that we can continue to see more states do, and maybe some formal recognition by the government or encouraging them. I think that that's the way to go. And, you know, truly, as we talk about minimum standards, I don't think that what's being suggested is pushing one technology or one software platform above another. When we talk about cloud computing now, something that just a few years ago no one imagined that would be part of a smart grid conversation, hardware and software. I think what's key is that we find a way where you can plug something into something else and that they can talk to one another, and that the software apparatus, whether we talk about Mac or we talk about PCs, Microsoft, Apple, it's amazing how software that's written today, how it doesn't matter what system you're on, you can work with one another. And I think that's all that we're suggesting. And if there's a way to encourage what I'm hearing today through the testimony, that we can find a way to have interconnection standards, we can have a way to have interoperable standards associated with making these things talk to one another, but then the gamut runs as it may, and the market's going to develop the most efficient and effective tools to allow this to happen, to empower consumers, to make sure utilities know the certainty of what's happening with loads, to prevent power outages. Hopefully, like in New Mexico, we prevent natural gas outages, as we saw in Texas with rolling blackouts recently, and it gives those tools more so that the commission's working closely with the utility companies are working closely with the businesses, and we're saving money in the end. This is going to put more money in people's pockets. It's going to put more money in small businesses' pockets, and it's going to save money associated with the impact that dramatically happens in a community when we have these power outages. And so I'm encouraged by this hearing, and I think there's a lot of promise here, and I think there's actually a lot of common ground between all of our colleagues here in the Congress with wanting to do the right thing here. So appreciate it again, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for my time.
Thank you. Gentleman's time's expired. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, but I won't take 5 minutes because I know Chairman Quayle has already recognized all of you and thanked you. But I'd feel bad if I didn't thank the Texans on there. Rik Drummond, small business leader, thank you. And of course, I always save the best for last. Chairman Nelson, I really came down here just to see if she's as attractive and intelligent as everybody always says she is. And we're glad to have each of you. We know you gave up something. It took something to prepare you and to bring you here. Thank you for what you're doing. And don't judge our interest in you by the empty seats, because everybody has 2 or 3 committees, and this goes into a permanent record, and they'll all have copies of it. And thank you for very much. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Rohrbacher, who is, for those that are present today, he's my favorite in the entire committee that are Republicans. Chair, I recognize Mr. Rohrbacher.
Now, how do I follow that? You know, I've been hearing about the smart grid, and we have to do something about the grid for so long. I mean, it just, over the years, it just, and quite frankly, I'm not an engineer, and I don't understand all of the aspects of some of the things you've been talking about today. Some of them are a little bit above my pay grade, but there's some things that we do have to know here, and that's about the spending of government money and how it is being utilized to accomplish goals in the various departments and agencies. When will the smart grid be available and be actually being utilized by the public? Whoever wants to answer that?
I'll attempt to answer that. I think, when you picture the entire smart grid working effectively and interoperating, I mean, we're literally talking about an evolution that's going to take 20 years or more. But we see parts of that today as you see various substations automated, you see the transmission grid automated, you see a greater...
20 years. And
yes, sir.
Tell me, how far in the evolution have we come? Would you say we're at year 15? Outside 15, or year... are we 15 years in, or 2 years in, or 1 year in? What are we in to that 20 years?
I think we discussed that a little bit earlier, like how is there a percentage on how smart the grid is today? And I think the answer to that really depends on the individual utilities, and those utilities know how much automation and how much smartness they have added to their, localized grid, if you will. But in terms of a nation, I have not heard a figure thrown out there to say whether we're 20% smart today or 25% or what that is. So I don't know that reference.
Smart as compared to what we were, let's say, 20 years ago. So, the smart grid will save us energy. The smart grid will ensure more security, et cetera. And how much will, in the end, the smart grid cost us to have in place as compared to what we're spending 10 years ago?
I don't have the answer to that question.
Let me just state, in Texas, what we've done is the customers who get the advanced meters are the ones who pay for it. So it's not through a tax. It's a fee on their bill. And even with that fee, our rates are lower in Texas than they were in 2001. I view smart grid ultimately as a cost savings tool because one, it gives customers the ability to reduce their usage, and under the current technology, you get your electric bill 45 days, and sometimes after you've...
I understand. When you succeed, I can't tell you how many times we've heard that when this program is in place, it's actually going to pay for itself, and so there's really no cost at all involved.
Well,
and absent that mindset, which I understand, and that it's not just smart grid that believes that stuff, but a lot of other people who come before us. Well, let's then look. How much money, Dr. Arnold, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act invested how much money in this effort, and how much has been spent?
The Recovery Act funds totaled $17 million, and all of that will have been spent by the end of this fiscal year.
17 million?
I'm sorry. Yes, 17 million in terms of the Nist work on the interoperability standards.
Right.
So that is just the Recovery Act funds, and that represents about half of the total funds. The rest was from the Nist normal STRS appropriations. So
$17 million were spent in the last year, you're saying?
Since about mid-2009.
2009, and that money was matched, of course, by the money that was already allocated for this project. Is that right?
Well, approximately the same, a little bit less. I believe it's about $15 million will have been spent through the end of this fiscal year out of NIST's STRS normal funding.
And once the recovery, the ARRA money is all gone, and it sounds like it is, the budget goes down back to what it was normally. Is that what's happening?
Well, I mean, to sustain the effort at the current pace, we would have to increase the STRS component. If we continue with flat funding on the STRS, it's going to imply a significant reduction in the level of activity.
Okay, and so when we were trying to figure out the total amount that NIST is spending, then is not 17, it's 35 million?
Well, through the end of FY11, it's about 17 plus 15. You can do the math
Okay.
over that period.
So that's $32 million, and that level, that $32 million level, then will be cut back to what, basically in half. Is that correct? Is that what we're hearing?
Well, the President's budget request for FY12 included an increase in the STRS component to maintain a level of effort that is at a level that we need to sustain progress. But if those funds are not available, there will be a significant reduction and probably a slowdown in our effort.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will wait to see if there's a second round to see if this money is being spent in the most efficient way. Thank you.
Your 10 minutes has expired.
Thank you.
Gentlemen always ask good questions, and we come back to you if we maybe Mr. Lipinski, gentleman from Maryland, for 5 minutes or whatever you really need. Recognize you, a good man to work with on this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not from Maryland, but Illinois, it's close, but
Maryland, Illinois. Your hometown is Maryland, Illinois, right? That's okay.
If you want that to be, if you want me to say that, yes, it is. As long as I get my 5 minutes of question time. Dr. Arnold, I'm pleased to see your section, your testimony about protecting consumer interests. Now, Mr. Rohrbacher had just said he's not an engineer. He started out his question with that. Well, I am trained as an engineer, although I won't try to claim that I know everything about the smart grid. But what I do know, I'm excited about the potential benefits. We can have a more robust and resilient power system. We can diminish peak usage. We give consumers more control. These are all great things that we can get from a smart grid. But right now, in my home state of Illinois, there's a tough legislative fight going on over who is going to pay for the new technology and who gets the benefit. AARP is strongly opposing the Illinois Infrastructure Modernization Act because of the potential for automatic rate increases. The Governor of Illinois, Governor Quinn, the Attorney General, Lisa Madigan, have also expressed concerns about this bill. Now, I share some of these concerns, and I think it's my job to make sure that, say, a senior in my district, someone living on a fixed income is protected. And, I worry that the push for a smart grid could just mean installing smart meters at consumer expense so that utilities can then go ahead and lay off their meter readers. So as I said, I know the potential is there for great benefits. What can you tell me, Dr. Arnold, about what elements of Nist standards will help consumers control their energy usage and save money? And what can we do? And I don't know if this probably isn't for Nist to make the determination on this, but my concern is how do we make sure that this information is going to be used by consumers to save money, or how do we make that as likely as possible? We can't guarantee anything. I can't guarantee anyone does anything, but we have to make that likely. But first, Dr. Arnold, what will help consumers control their energy usage and save money with the smart grid?
So in terms of saving money and controlling usage, there are two elements of that. One is wasting less energy, so reducing your overall usage. And the other element is reducing your usage during peak periods when it's very expensive for the system to generate that energy. In terms of consumers wasting less energy, the fact that consumers have no knowledge today about how much they're consuming, is an issue. And with the smart grid, consumers, will be able to, and in many cases, like in Texas, are able to see how much they're using, even on a near real-time basis, and that knowledge.
Excuse me, that's one thing I was wondering. If I have a smart meter hooked up in my home, will I be able then to hook that up to my computer and see in real time my usage, or will I have to wait for the utility company to get me the information?
The technical capability is there to transmit that data to either the utility, where you can get it on the web, or locally, so it can be broadcast to a display within your home, so you can see that in real time. I have such a meter, in which I do that in my home. The other aspect in terms of reducing usage during peak periods, which is benefits everyone, because you need to provide less generation capacity and transmission capacity. My expectation is that technology will allow this to be done automatically, where you'll be able to set push a green button on your appliance to tell it you want to run in eco mode, and it will automatically figure out the best time to run. Obviously, a consumer will always be able to override that if they need to have something done at a certain time. But the technology will be there to allow this to be, basically automated, so the consumer can set it and forget it.
Very quickly, Chairman Nelson, how do you believe in Texas you were able to institute this and have the consumer save money? Were there specific provisions that you put into the law in Texas that helped this to occur?
Yes, sir. The Texas legislature passed legislation in 2005 and 2007 encouraging the deployment of smart meters, and they set up a system for how it would be paid for, which, as you indicated, was a controversial issue and continues to be, but they addressed that.
But how do you get people to, if the chairman will allow me, how do you can give people information, how do you maximize the likelihood that they will use this information to help save electricity and money?
Well, there's a big customer education component of this, where customers have to be aware of what they're doing. So we rolled it out. We're in the process right now of doing a test where CenterPoint and Encore, our two biggest utilities in Houston and Dallas, are doing a pilot with 500 in-home devices and educating customers about it. But we have retail providers in the Texas market, and that market is competitive, and so they want to get customers, and so they're trying to give a value-added thing, and so they're working with customers to provide them information. Like some of them send out a once-a-week note to their customers by email and say, this is how you're spending, this is what you've spent. If you continue using at the same level, your bill will be this. Or, some customers use every day. But when we have a hot summer like we had this summer, where in Austin our August temperature average was 105, in spite of the fact that we've got low rates, those bills are big, and I think the larger the bill gets, the more the customer has an incentive to shave some of that off if they can.
Well, thank you very much, and thank the chairman for the indulgence here.
Gentleman's time has expired. The ranking member has indicated he has no objection. Mr. Rohrbacher asking one more question. Chairman recognizes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When we're talking about standards, and again, I plead to be guilty of not having the expertise of having the in-depth questions that you probably deserve. But let me just ask, when you have new standards, and that's what we're talking about with Nist, and it's a major part of this whole operation's success is the standards of what you're going to be required to have a smart grid. That means, of course, there's going to have to be new technologies. Now, I note that the Department of Energy, where you're spending $35 million, they're spending $3.4 billion on smart grid technology development. Are you confident that we're going to be able to have the technology necessary, number one, to meet the standards, and will this equipment be available, do you believe, by American manufacturers rather than having us being dependent on overseas sources?
So I'd like to address that. The stakeholders in our process involve, industry. They're really the biggest, part of the process, and so they're at the table because they want the standards so that they can, build the products and the utilities can use them. We've tried wherever we can to, rather than reinventing the wheel, to pick up standards that have been used in other applications and modify them for the smart grid to allow these things to get deployed most quickly. In areas where there's entirely new functionality, you have to do something new, and we're always looking for the best way to do that. We've placed major emphasis on being, in a leadership posture with respect to the international standards. So rather than our picking up standards that others are developing, we're developing them here, bringing them to the international standards organizations, and we're having a great deal of success in getting standards adopted internationally. And I can tell you that in other parts of the world that are behind us in developing their frameworks for the smart grid, they recognize our leadership and are using the results of our standards work as the basis for their efforts. And we're doing that specifically to maximize the export opportunities for U.S. suppliers.
Yeah, there it was. Now, so you're confident that what you're doing is going to actually be a boon to American manufacturers and American technology corporations, and not is that something that you have in mind, or is this something that you're just confident of?
We have that very much in mind. I would point to the International Energy Agency estimates over the next 20 years, $10 trillion will be spent globally on modernization and build-out of electrical grids. The estimate, as far as I can tell, for the U.S. is about $2 trillion. So there's the market opportunity outside of the U.S. is much greater than it is in the U.S., and so we have very much in mind creating a standards framework that will allow U.S. manufacturers to not only build the U.S. grid, but also export that technology to other parts of the world.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That does answer my question. I appreciate you giving me that last chance.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired, and I want to thank the witnesses for their very valuable testimony and the members for their questions. Members of the subcommittee might have additional questions for the witness, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and statements from members. The witnesses are now excused, and if I can get this page turned. Hell, I can't get this number. We are adjourned.
When in
All right, boys. Yeah, enjoy it. See you guys.